Allison, good afternoon. Another tough day in Florida. 9,200 cases reported. Certainly, we've seen much higher numbers in recent days, 15,000 in one day over the weekend. But it's the fatalities that's grabbing headlines today. 132 deaths reported in this latest batch, and that now brings the state's total to 4,400 fatalities. It is the fourth time in 6 days, Allison, that this state has seen a new peak in increases. So concerning when we talk about the cycle of infection to hospitalization, and the concern there was that there would be an increase in deaths. That is what we're seeing on some level right now as hospitalization numbers are rising, healthcare systems, I should say, getting stressed, and testing, a major part of the conversation. Where I'm standing right now at the Miami Beach Convention Center, there are lines of cars down the block right now. Some of those folks have been waiting an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours in some cases. They are going until 5 o'clock. There's not a shortage of tests. There's a shortage of manpower. And at the end of that, 5 o'clock, if there's still people waiting, which there have been in recent days, they don't get tests. There is also the lag time problem as well. Right now, Florida is supposed to be hitting 48 hours between when you get tested and when you find out. But there's folks that are going 5, 6, 7 days. We've talked to someone who waited 15 days, Allison, to get that test back. Imagine waiting 2 weeks to find out whether or not you have COVID-19. And perhaps even more shockingly, one of the top infectious disease experts for the area, Dr. Eileen Marty, said that at this moment, Florida right now is only doing 17% of the tests that it should be doing in order to contain the virus. So huge testing numbers, but clearly not enough yet. Governor Ron DeSantis talking right now about trying to expedite ways to get people faster results, creating lanes that are just for symptomatic people. Perhaps that will work, but the state right now waiting for a little bit more guidance as cases and deaths, sadly, continue to spiral.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.